Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Mobile, Alabama. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The carriage arrived at Magnolia Grove Plantation on a humid August evening in 1851. The wheels cut through the mud, leaving deep grooves in the path that led to the main house. William Fuller, the new owner of the property, stepped down and surveyed what would become his legacy. The grand columns of the main house stood tall against the darkening sky, but even from the driveway one could see the peeling paint, the cracked windows, the signs of neglect that had begun to take hold. The plantation had been abandoned for nearly 7 months after the mysterious disappearance of its previous owner, Josiah Hill. What was peculiar about the case wasn't merely that Josiah had vanished without a trace, but rather the silence that enveloped the entire affair. Not a single newspaper in Mobile had reported the disappearance. Not a single authority had launched an investigation. It was as if Josiah Hill had been quietly erased from society's memory, with only whispers remaining. William had purchased the property at an auction for a surprisingly low price. The auctioneer had spoken quickly, almost nervously, as if eager to be rid of the responsibility. When William inquired about the previous owner, he was met with averted gazes and mumbled responses about moving west or family matters. It wasn't until William signed the final papers that the clerk, a thin man with perpetually moist eyes, leaned forward and whispered, "The slaves won't enter the East Wing, not since that night." William dismissed the comment as superstitious nonsense. He had purchased 23 slaves along with the property, and he expected complete obedience and access to every corner of his new home. But as he stood in the driveway that first evening, watching as his wife Margaret and their 2 grown daughters descended from the carriage, he couldn't help but notice how the slave quarters, visible at the edge of the property, stood completely still and silent, despite the hour not yet calling for sleep. County records would later show that Josiah Hill had acquired Magnolia Grove in 1845, following the death of his father. What the records didn't show, but what local memory preserved, was Josiah's reputation for unusual methods. Unlike most plantation owners in Mobile County, Josiah had developed systems of his own design. The journal detailed how Josiah had divided his enslaved workers not by traditional roles, but by what he called temperament categories. Those he designated as Category A were housed separately, given different food, and subjected to what Josiah described as behavioral modifications. The journal never explicitly detailed what these modifications entailed, but it meticulously recorded changes in productivity, compliance, and what Josiah referred to as quietude of spirit. Margaret? Fuller noticed it first, the silence. His approach to plantation management had been documented in a private journal, which William would discover months later, hidden behind a loose brick in the fireplace of the master bedroom. Having lived on plantations her entire life, she was accustomed to the background sounds of work, distant voices, tools against wood and earth, the occasional shout of instruction. But Magnolia Grove existed in an unnatural quiet. Even the 23 enslaved people moved with a deliberate silence, their eyes downcast, their responses minimal. When Margaret would enter a room, those cleaning or serving would pause momentarily, their bodies tensing as if expecting something other than her presence. It was on their 3rd night at Magnolia Grove that William and Margaret first heard the sound, a steady, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere within the walls. William initially attributed it to the settling of the old house, or perhaps a branch against a window. But when he rose to investigate, the sound ceased completely, only to resume once he had returned to bed. The following morning, William asked his new overseer, a stoic man named Samuel Jenkins, about the sound. Jenkins, who had worked at Magnolia Grove under Josiah Hill for 2 years, paused before responding. "The house makes sounds, sir. Best not to dwell on them." William pressed further, but Jenkins politely excused himself, claiming urgent matters in the fields. It was the first hint that those who had been present during Josiah's time maintained a conspiracy of silence about certain aspects of life at Magnolia Grove. The Mobile County Courthouse held limited records regarding Josiah Hill. His birth in 1815, his inheritance of his father's property in 1845, several business transactions, and then nothing after October 1850. No death certificate, no record of sale of his assets, no indication of departure. It was as if Josiah had simply stepped out of documented existence. A clerk at the courthouse, upon hearing William's inquiries, mentioned that Josiah had been known to frequent the Mobile Medical Society, an unusual association for a plantation owner. The society kept records of its members and their interests, and it was there that William discovered Josiah had developed an intense fascination with what was then called slave melancholy, a condition recognized by some physicians of the time as affecting enslaved people who exhibited withdrawn behavior, loss of will, or resistance through silence. Josiah had apparently been conducting his own research on the condition, with the blessing of certain society members who shared his belief that the condition stemmed from inherent differences in the constitution of different races rather than the obvious trauma of enslavement itself. His methods, while never fully described in the Society's records, were referred to as innovative and worthy of further study. As September arrived, bringing no relief from the heat, the Fuller family settled into a routine of uncomfortable adjustment. The enslaved workers performed their duties efficiently but maintained a distance that went beyond the usual boundaries between owner and owned. They spoke when spoken to, followed instructions precisely, but offered nothing beyond what was explicitly requested. One woman in particular caught Margaret's attention. Clara, who served as the house cook, was the only one who occasionally met Margaret's gaze directly. There was something in Clara's eyes, not defiance exactly, but a knowledge, an awareness that suggested she had seen things that Margaret couldn't begin to comprehend. It was Clara who finally broke the silence one evening as she was clearing the dinner dishes. Margaret had remained at the table after the others had retired to the parlor, nursing a headache that the persistent heat had intensified. "The tapping comes from the east wing, Ma'am," Clara said quietly, her back to Margaret as she stacked plates. "From the room where Master Hill conducted his sessions." Margaret straightened in her chair. "What sessions, Clara?" Clara turned, her expression carefully neutral. "The improvement sessions, ma'am, for those of us who needed to be fixed." Before Margaret could question her further, Clara added, "There's a space beneath the floorboards, in the room at the end of the east corridor. Master Hill called it the quiet place. For reflection, he said." She paused, then added softly, "Not everyone who went for reflection came back to us." The following day, while William was overseeing work in the distant fields, Margaret made her way to the east wing. The corridor was dusty with disuse, the wallpaper peeling in long, curling strips like shedding skin. At the end of the hall stood a door, unremarkable except for the fact that it was the only one with a substantial iron lock. The key, Margaret discovered after hours of searching, was hidden in Josiah's study, inside a hollowed-out book of anatomy. The lock turned with surprising ease, as if recently oiled, despite the apparent abandonment of the room. Inside, the space was clinically sparse. A sturdy wooden chair sat in the center, with leather straps attached to the arms and legs. A table against the wall held an array of instruments that Margaret, in her sheltered existence, couldn't identify. Some resembled medical tools, others more like the implements used for training hunting dogs. A cabinet with glass doors revealed row upon row of bottles, each meticulously labelled with names and dates. But it was the floor that drew Margaret's attention. Unlike the hardwood throughout the rest of the house, this room had been fitted with metal plates that covered the entire surface, and in the centre a square section that looked as if it could be lifted. Margaret knelt and found small handholds at the edges of the square. When she pulled, the section rose easily, revealing a space beneath the floor, a pit approximately 6 feet deep and equally wide, lined with more metal. The bottom was covered with a layer of straw, now rotted and mouldy. The smell that rose from the opening was not the expected mustiness of an unused space, but something sharper, more organic. Margaret quickly replaced the floor section and backed out of the room. As she turned to leave, she noticed something scratched into the wall beside the door, partially hidden by the peeling wallpaper. Pulling the paper away revealed a series of vertical marks, the kind used to count days or events, and beside them crude initials scratched with what must have been a fingernail or small object, CJ, PM, SW, and a dozen others. That night at dinner, Margaret observed Clara with new awareness. The cook moved efficiently around the dining room, her face impassive, but Margaret now noticed a slight stiffness in her movements, particularly in her left shoulder, as if an old injury troubled her. After the meal, when the family had again retreated to the parlour, Margaret remained behind and directly asked Clara, "Were you taken to the quiet place?" Clara's hands stilled on the dishes she was gathering. Without turning, she replied, "3 times, ma'am. The 3rd time was after I dropped Master Hill's breakfast tray. My hands shook for weeks after the 2nd time, you see." "What did he do in that room, Clara?" Clara finally turned, and for a brief moment, her carefully maintained expression cracked, revealing something raw beneath. "He said he was helping us find our true nature, ma'am, that some of us had forgotten our place in the order of things, and he was simply reminding us." She looked down at her hands. "He would speak very softly while he worked, said shouting clouded the understanding, but a whisper reached deeper into the mind." Over the following weeks, William Fuller noticed a change in his wife. Margaret had always been a practical woman, not given to flights of fancy or nervous disposition. But now she started at small sounds, her eyes constantly drawn to the corridor leading to the east wing. When William asked about her distraction, Margaret claimed it was merely the adjustment to their new home, the responsibilities of managing a property larger than their previous one. But at night, when William was asleep, Margaret would lie awake, listening to the tapping in the walls. Sometimes it maintained that steady rhythm she'd first noticed. Other times it seemed random, desperate. Once she was certain she heard it form a pattern that reminded her of the Morse code she'd seen telegraph operators use. 3 short taps, 3 long, 3 short again. In mid-October, a heavy storm lashed the Gulf Coast, bringing torrential rain that turned the plantation grounds into a quagmire. The enslaved workers struggled to shore up drainage ditches to prevent flooding in the fields, while inside the main house, servants rushed to place buckets under numerous leaks in the roof. It was during this storm that Samuel Jenkins, the overseer, finally approached William with information about Josiah Hill. Soaked to the skin and mud-splattered, Jenkins requested a private word in William's study. Once the door was closed, Jenkins spoke with uncharacteristic urgency. "You need to seal off the east wing, sir. Board it up, brick it in, I don't care how, but it needs to be closed before the ground gets any softer." William, taken aback by the man's intensity, demanded an explanation. Jenkins ran a hand over his face, leaving a smear of mud across his cheek. "Josiah Hill didn't disappear, sir. At least, not in the way people think." He took a deep breath. "There was a revolt. Small. Contained. Just 5 of them. They'd been in the quiet place too many times, you see. Something broke in them." William leaned forward. "What happened to Hill?" "They took him to his special room. used his own methods on him, from what I could piece together afterward. Then they buried him. Jenkins' voice dropped. Not in the cemetery, sir. Under the floor. In his quiet place. I helped the remaining house servants clean up, make it look like he'd packed and left. We burned his travel clothes, sent his horse running loose toward Mobile. Everyone was happy to maintain the story, those who participated, to avoid punishment, and the rest of us. Well, no one much cared for Josiah Hill or his methods. William sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb this information. And the participants in this revolt. Dead, sir. All of them. Took their own lives in the days after, one by one. Couldn't live with what they'd done, I suppose, even to a man like Hill. Jenkins paused. Except for Clara, she was part of it, but she didn't follow the others. Said someone needed to remember, to bear witness. As if summoned by her name, a scream echoed from the direction of the kitchen. William and Jenkins rushed toward the sound, finding Margaret standing in the doorway, her face ashen. Inside, Clara lay on the floor, a kitchen knife beside her, blood pooling rapidly around her body. She just did it. Right in front of me, Margaret stammered. She looked at me and said, "He's tapping. He's still down there tapping." That night, as rain continued to pound against the windows and Clara's body lay wrapped in sheets in the storehouse awaiting burial, the tapping in the walls grew louder, more insistent. No longer confined to nighttime, it continued throughout the day, audible even over the storm. William, shaken by Jenkins' revelation and Clara's suicide, finally agreed to investigate the East Wing with Margaret. The room at the end of the corridor looked exactly as Margaret had described it, though now, in the flickering lantern light with the storm raging outside, the medical instruments cast grotesque shadows on the walls. William stared at the metal floor plate that Margaret indicated could be lifted. "Help me," he said, and together they raised the heavy section. The pit below now contained several inches of murky water, the result of leaks and seepage from the storm. The rotted straw floated on the surface like clumps of sodden hair. William lowered the lantern, its light reflecting off the water and illuminating the space. There, partially submerged, was what appeared to be a bundle of cloth. But as the lantern light shifted, the unmistakable curve of a human skull emerged from the water, the lower jaw detached but still present, creating a frozen, silent scream. William nearly dropped the lantern in shock. "Dear God," he whispered. The official report filed with the Mobile County Sheriff's Office on October 23, 1851, stated that human remains discovered at Magnolia Grove Plantation were identified as those of Josiah Hill, previous owner of the property, who appeared to have fallen through weakened floorboards during renovation work and become trapped. The cause of death was listed as accidental. What the report didn't mention was the state of Hill's remains, how the fingertips were worn to the bone, how the skull showed signs of previous trauma consistent with a severe beating, or how the positioning of the body suggested that Hill had been alive for some time after being placed in the pit, desperately trying to escape. The Mobile Register published a brief obituary for Josiah Hill on November 2nd, noting his contributions to local agricultural societies and his interest in medical research. No family members came forward to claim his remains. William Fuller sold Magnolia Grove in December of that same year, taking a significant financial loss. The family relocated to Tennessee, where Margaret's health, which had deteriorated rapidly after the discovery in the East Wing, showed some improvement. They never spoke publicly about their brief time at the plantation. The property changed hands 8 times over the next 15 years, with no owner remaining longer than 20 months. In 1867, during Reconstruction, the main house was destroyed by fire, the cause undetermined. Local legend claimed the fire started in the East Wing. In 1959, when the land was being surveyed for potential development, workers uncovered a mass grave near the former site of the slave quarters. The remains of at least 17 individuals were found, all showing signs of unusual trauma to their shoulder and leg bones, consistent with prolonged restraint. The discovery was briefly reported in the Mobile Press Register, but was quickly overshadowed by civil rights demonstrations occurring at the same time. The case file was archived and later microfilmed in 1964, then subsequently misplaced during a courthouse renovation. The land remained undeveloped and was eventually incorporated into a nature preserve, the foundations of Magnolia Grove gradually reclaimed by the Alabama forest. But among the descendants of those who worked the land, the story of Josiah Hill and his quiet place persisted through generations. They spoke of how the tapping could sometimes still be heard on stormy nights, not from within walls, but from deep within the earth itself. A steady rhythm, like fingernails on metal, trying to communicate from beyond a silenced grave. What Josiah Hill discovered in his cruel experiments was not the secret to subduing the human spirit, but rather the terrible truth that some actions echo far beyond their moment. In his determination to create silence, he instead created a sound that would never truly fade away. The desperate communication of those fighting to be heard, to be remembered, to bear witness to what occurred in that room at the end of the East Corridor. The Mobile Historical Society maintains a small collection of artifacts recovered from the Magnolia Grove site before it was closed to further excavation. Among these is a metal plate, approximately 1 square foot in size, bearing marks on one side that archaeological experts have identified as consistent with sustained impact from a human hand. The plate is not on public display, but remains in the Society's archived collection, along with a faded journal containing what appears to be research notes, the author's name long since obscured by water damage and time. And if you visit the nature preserve that now encompasses the former Magnolia Grove plantation on a quiet day, locals say you can still find the clearing where the main house once stood. Nothing grows there despite numerous attempts at reforestation. The ground remains barren, as if the earth itself remembers what it once contained and refuses to bring forth new life from soil so thoroughly soaked in silent suffering. The most disturbing aspect of the Josiah Hill case, perhaps, is not what was discovered, but what remains unknown. Of the 23 enslaved people recorded in the plantation's inventory, only 19 were accounted for in subsequent records. 4 individuals, listed only by first names, Solomon, Ruth, Emily, and Isaac, vanished from all documentation. No death records, no transfer of ownership, no indication of escape. They are among the countless souls lost to history, their stories untold, their fates unrecorded. But in the persistent tapping that visitors sometimes report hearing in the preserve, there may be an echo of their presence, a reminder that even the most thoroughly silenced voices find ways to make themselves heard across decades and centuries, continuing to tap against the walls we build to contain the darkest chapters of our collective past.